He laughed at the pitch the moment he saw the founder's face. "Wait, you're the guy presenting this? I thought you were part of the cleaning crew." That's how it started. One boardroom, 7 executives, and a young black entrepreneur standing alone with a tablet full of code they never bothered to read. For minutes in, they cut him off, laughed, mocked, told him his idea had potential if he were still in college. No one asked questions. No one saw the product. They just saw his skin. That meeting should have buried his future. Instead, it lit a fuse. What followed was betrayal, sabotage, theft, humiliation, and a secret that would shake the entire tech industry when revealed. But before the truth exploded, before power shifted, before the system was forced to look itself in the mirror, there was just him, alone, outnumbered, undervalued, until everything changed. Want to know what happens when the person you humiliate holds the power to decide your fate? Stick around. Like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. What part of this story hit you hardest? And where are you watching from? We want to hear your thoughts. Jalen Brooks walked into the executive boardroom of Whitestone Ventures with quiet certainty and the kind of focus that had carried him through 5 years of product development, 3 funding rounds, and 100 closed doors. He wore his confidence like armor, pressed into a deep navy suit that didn't scream luxury, but whispered intention. He wasn't there to impress with clothes. His numbers would do the talking. A silver tablet rested in one hand, ready to project the journey of Looply, a B2B collaboration platform revolutionizing hybrid engineering teams. But as the boardroom door swung open and every white face turned to see him, there was a shift in the air. Subtle, calculated. Graham Whitaker, the billionaire CEO of Whitestone Ventures, reclined in his leather chair at the head of the table, fingers steepled, smile playing at the edges of his lips. "Well," he said, not even trying to mask the mockery in his tone, "you're Jalen Brooks?" Jalen offered a steady nod. "Yes, sir. Founder and CEO of Looply." The room remained silent. One of the partners stifled a grin. Graham leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Forgive me. For a second, I thought you were here to fix the A/V setup," he chuckled, glancing at the IT monitor in the corner. A few others laughed. Jalen didn't. "I appreciate your time," he said, connecting his tablet to the screen without missing a beat. "I believe you'll find what we're building is uniquely positioned to scale." Wait, Graham interrupted, waving a hand. "Let me ask, you're a dev, right? Back end? Maybe systems ops?" "I'm a founder," Jalen repeated. "Wrote the first 50,000 lines myself." "Impressive," Graham muttered, clearly unconvinced. The presentation began. Clean slides, scalable architecture, 8 months of consecutive growth, 4,300 active users, 19% month-over-month MRR increase, a vision that would reshape enterprise dev workflows across borders. Jalen explained calmly, clearly. Data-backed, tested, investor-ready. But before he even reached slide 5, Graham raised a hand. "I think we've seen enough." Jalen paused, confused. "You haven't seen the user case integrations, Jalen," Graham said, tilting his head like a parent speaking to a child. "This is cute. Seriously, if you were pitching to a high school business club, I'd fund the pizza." Another burst of laughter. Jalen's jaw tensed. He tapped to the next slide, but no one was watching. One of the partners was checking his phone. Another had leaned back, arms crossed, visibly bored. "Let's take a quick vote," Graham said casually. "All in favor of passing on the deck?" 7 hands went up instantly. "Unanimous," Graham announced. "Look, don't get discouraged. It's a neat concept. Maybe come back in a few years after you've got a real CEO." Jalen blinked slowly. The humiliation washed over him not in waves, but in still silence. He disconnected his tablet, nodded once without another word, and turned to leave. "Oh," Graham added as Jalen reached the door, "if Looply ever pivots into facility management tools, give me a call. Our janitorial systems are a mess." The same tablet lay beside his coffee, the same slides glowing silently, now reduced to background static behind the storm in his head. He hadn't slept. His inbox was quiet, too quiet. The investors who had shown interest prior to yesterday's meeting had all suddenly re-evaluated their strategy. He wasn't surprised. Word traveled fast in the VC ecosystem, especially when it came from someone like Graham Whitaker. Jalen glanced at his phone as it buzzed, a message from one of the junior analysts who had sat silently during the pitch. It read, "You should see what they're doing upstairs." "I'm sorry." Confused, Jalen stood, pocketed the device, and made his way toward the elevators. The same security guard who had waved him through yesterday now squinted at him with suspicion. Jalen flashed his guest badge. "Here to see Rory Klein," he lied smoothly, invoking the name of a mid-tier associate he had met once at a tech mixer. The elevator chimed, doors opened, and as he stepped onto the 27th floor, laughter greeted him before the carpet. Down the hallway, through the frosted glass of the main conference room, Jalen saw it. His presentation, looply, projected on the wall. But this wasn't a second chance. It was a mockery. Graham wasn't there, but Rory was, along with 6 interns gathered around the table, smirking as one of the senior VPs clicked through Jalen's deck. "Now," the VP said, pacing dramatically, "this, ladies and gentlemen, is exactly how not to pitch a billion-dollar idea." The interns chuckled. One leaned forward, whispering something about the founder's swagger and affirmative confidence, prompting another round of snide laughs. The VP grinned. "Slide 3 is my favorite. Look at that burn rate. Like he's running AWS on charity." Jalen's fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't move. Not yet. He watched, memorized faces, took the emotional blow in silence. The intern nearest the glass turned and saw him. For a split second, no one breathed. The room froze. The VP turned, locking eyes with Jalen, and for the first time, his smirk faltered. Jalen didn't speak. He just shook his head once, slow and deliberate, and walked away. He made it to the lobby before security intercepted him. "Sir," one of the 2 guards said, firm but polite, "we've been asked to escort you off the premises." Jalen stared at him. "On what grounds?" The guard hesitated, tapping at the earpiece in his collar. "You apparently accessed an unauthorized floor. Executive levels are restricted to cleared guests only." Jalen scoffed. "I was just here yesterday, pitching in that same damn room." The second guard, older, softened slightly. "Orders came from legal upstairs, sir. Please don't make this harder." Jalen exhaled slowly and held up both hands. "Fine." As he was walked out through the front doors of Whitestone Tower, heads turned in the lobby. No one said a word, but everyone looked at the black man being calmly but deliberately removed from the temple of innovation. Jalen didn't fight it. He walked tall, let them stare. Once outside, he paused on the steps, pulled out his phone, and opened the folder marked contingency. Inside were names. 3 days later, Jalen Brooks stood outside the mirrored facade of an uptown San Francisco skyscraper, the morning fog still clinging to the glass like hesitation. He adjusted the cuffs of his blazer, eyes glancing once more at the calendar invite on his phone. 9:30 a.m., Nolan Tech Group, 41st floor, Partner Exploration Meeting, CTO in attendance. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a door. Nolan Tech was one of the largest enterprise SaaS distributors in the West, and if they integrated Looply into their toolkit, it would mean instant scale. The call had come unexpectedly, the tone warm, even impressed. Apparently someone on their side had found Looply through an old Y Combinator link and wanted to learn more. Jalen had barely finished reading the invite when he booked the flight. This was his shot to shake off the mockery at Whitestone. He checked his reflection, squared his shoulders, and walked into the lobby. But as he approached the security desk to check in, a receptionist tapped the earpiece tucked behind her blonde ponytail and paused mid-keystroke. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her smile faltering. "It appears the meeting has been canceled." Jalen blinked. "Canceled?" "Yes," she nodded politely, already looking uncomfortable. "Just a moment ago. I'll call up to confirm." She turned slightly, speaking in a hushed voice to someone on the other end of the line. Jalen's pulse quickened. Something fell off. Her brow furrowed. "Yes, okay, yes, I'll let him know." She turned back toward him with a corporate perfect smile. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Brooks. The CTO is unavailable today, and the meeting's been postponed indefinitely. They'll be in touch. Jalen didn't move. He felt it, the familiar chill of doors closing not because of merit, but because of whispers. He left the lobby in silence, phone clenched in his palm. 10 minutes later, sitting in a corner cafe, his suspicions were confirmed when he opened an encrypted message from a friend inside Nolan's legal department. The text read, "Off the record, someone from Whitestone called your name in a risk call. Said you had presentation issues and weren't structurally honest about loop lease valuation." Jalen stared at the screen for a long moment, then typed back one word: figures. He knew who had made that call. Graham Whitaker wasn't content with rejecting him. He wanted to scorch the ground behind him. It wasn't about business. It was about control. Graham couldn't handle the thought of being outsmarted by someone like Jalen, someone who didn't look or talk like the people he usually invested in. Jalen leaned back in his chair, staring at the steam curling from his untouched coffee, and realized this was no longer just about funding. This was war. The next blow came that night. As Jalen scrolled through the Looply Slack channel, he saw a ping from his co-founder Malik, linking to a tweet that had just gone viral. It was a photo of Jalen outside the Whitestone Tower, flanked by security guards. The caption read, "Another visionary founder, escorted out for pitching vaporware. LOL." The comments were brutal. Classic entitlement. Play stupid games. Looks like someone fumbled their TED Talk. Jalen's chest tightened. The worst part wasn't the trolls, it was the silence from the VCs who had promised term sheets. Within an hour, 2 of the warmest leads dropped out of negotiations, citing a shift in investment priority. By midnight, a third emailed a bland paragraph about restructuring timelines and uncertainty in the vertical. Jalen knew what it meant. They weren't investing in Looply. They were scared of the shadow Graham cast. He shut his laptop and sat in the dark, not in defeat, but in calculation. They thought reputation was leverage. But the silence didn't last long. It was broken, not by opportunity, but by insult. At 7:42 a.m., his inbox pinged with a subject line that stopped him cold. "You might want to hear this." The sender was anonymous. Attached was a short audio file. Jalen clicked play. The voice was unmistakable. Graham Whitaker, laughing during what sounded like a casual dinner conversation, the clinking of glasses in the background. "The kid's smart," Graham said between sips, "but let's be honest, he's an affirmative action experiment. You invite 1 or 2 of them into the room so you don't get torched online, and if they're halfway decent, hey, it's a PR win." A second voice, likely another executive, chuckled and replied, "Too bad he thought it was real." Then Graham again, "Yeah, I mean he didn't pitch. He preached. I need someone who can scale, not someone trying to check a diversity box with a laptop." The file ended there. Jalen sat still, breathing through his teeth, his hands clenched so tightly the veins in his wrist showed. He'd known Graham was arrogant, condescending, but this was naked. It was cruelty wrapped in performance, and it wasn't just dismissive, it was strategic erasure. The audio began to circulate in private channels within hours. First in group chats, then in Twitter DMs. By mid-afternoon, it had found its way into tech community forums where moderators tried to block it, but screenshots spread like wildfire. Worse still, someone had taken it upon themselves to start a thread on one of the largest internal Silicon Valley Slack communities, a pseudo-anonymous group of developers, PMs, and startup insiders. The thread title read, "Looply? More like Loopy." The opening post included a blurry photo of Jalen from his college days, wearing a hoodie and smiling, with the caption, "Reminder that not every founder is a visionary. Some are just loud." The replies were vicious. One user joked, "I guess he thought swagger equals valuation." Another commented, "His pitch deck looked like it was made in PowerPoint 2003. A third chimed in, "Honestly, I thought the dude was a podcast host. Didn't know he was trying to build a company." But it didn't stop there. They dissected everything. His voice, calling it too street. His name, calling it too much. Even his family. Someone dug up an old interview with his mother from a local newspaper and posted it under the comment, "Gotta love a good bootstrap story. Too bad he tripped over the laces." Jalen scrolled in silence, each word like a needle through the skin. Not because they hurt him personally, he had built up scar tissue over years, but because they were meant to delegitimize everything he had created. Looply wasn't just a platform. It was sweat, late nights, borrowed money, missed birthdays, and countless moments of doubt he had fought through. And now, all of that was being reduced to a punchline in a Slack thread. He closed the laptop and stared at the ceiling. The pain wasn't in the rejection. It was in the coordinated ease with which they made him invisible. He didn't just feel underestimated. The headline read, "Excited to unveil Synchronet, a new platform to power global dev teams in real time. Big thanks to Whitestone for believing in bold infrastructure plays." The face attached to the post was Trent Rourke, one of the board members who had sat across from Jalen during his humiliating pitch at Whitestone. The post had over 2,000 likes, flooded with comments praising the innovation, the sleek UI, and the visionary simplicity. Jalen clicked the link to Synchronet's landing page. As it loaded, his heart slowed. The colors were different, the layout rearranged, but the core mechanics, the framework, the use case funnel, it was Looply, dressed in new branding. His roadmap, his scaling model, even the asynchronous relay protocol he had architected months earlier, all now rebranded under Trent's name and being pitched as Whitestone's newest portfolio star. Jalen stared at the screen as if it might blink and correct itself. But it didn't. They had taken everything. No credit, no mention, just silence. White silence, polished and press-released. Rage sat like lead in his throat, but he pushed it down and opened a folder he hadn't touched in months. His original Git repositories, timestamps, development logs, even internal whiteboard screenshots from his Moreau account. He zipped everything into a file and sent it to Derek Ng, a sharp intellectual property lawyer he had met during a startup accelerator a year prior. The subject line was clear: IP theft urgent. Within the hour, Derek responded. The email was polite but cold. "Jalen, I reviewed the materials. I believe you, 100%. But here's the issue: idea-based IP in software is notoriously hard to defend without exact code-based cloning or NDA violations. Unless there's a signed agreement or access audit trail linking Trent directly to your proprietary work, a case like this would be considered circumstantial. Honestly, it would cost you 6 figures and still get buried." Jalen read the message twice. Then again. The words didn't just disappoint him, they hollowed him. He had the proof. He had the evidence. But not the power. Trent had taken the very architecture of Looply, slapped a new skin on it. And now the same ecosystem that mocked Jalen was celebrating it under a different face. And the legal system? It was built for those with capital and connections. 2 things Jalen had been bled of. He sat in his dimly lit apartment, watching Trent's face replay on a promotional video as he explained Synchronet's unique ability to reduce latency in distributed teams through an adaptive routing layer. Jalen had written that code. Not drafted, not imagined, written, alone, at 2 a.m., in a WeWork with flickering lights and cold pizza. And now it was being praised by Forbes. The bile rose. But Jalen didn't shout. He didn't post. He didn't play defense. Instead, he opened another folder, one few people knew existed. In it were voice memos, messages from junior developers at Whitestone, screenshots from interns bragging about having seen the real deck before Synchronet launched. A photo, blurry but damning, of Trent in a private meeting room with Graham and one of Jalen's slides projected behind them, timestamped just 2 days after Jalen's pitch. He wasn't going to sue. He was going to expose. Not through law, through narrative. And once the story hit, the world wouldn't see him as the angry founder crying over a failed pitch. This wasn't just pressure. It was demolition. Piece by piece, they had taken everything he'd built, his pitch, his credibility, his reputation. And now they were coming for what was left. The first blow landed quietly, in a plain envelope shoved into the mailbox of his mother's house in East Oakland. It bore no return address, no stamp, just his mother's name in jagged letters. Inside was a folded sheet of printer paper, no more than 2 lines long. "Tell your son to stop chasing dreams he can't afford." It's time he learned his place. His mother called him, voice shaking, not out of fear, but out of rage. "Baby," she said, "you don't have to prove anything to them. They're afraid of what they can't control." Jalen sat silent for a long moment, trying to keep his voice steady as he promised her he was fine. But he wasn't. Not really. His savings had dried up trying to keep the Looply servers running. Payroll barely made it through the month, and his last credit line had been frozen after an anonymous complaint flagged pending litigation, with no source. His apartment lease renewal was due, and the landlord had left him a voicemail saying the rent would go up 20%. No exceptions. The final invoice from AWS landed that afternoon, blinking at him like a slow countdown. $3,876.27. He didn't have half of it. Looply was bleeding out. And worse, Jalen didn't even have the dignity of failing in peace. Everywhere he turned, whispers followed. Investors stopped replying. Friends hesitated to retweet. Even Malik, his co-founder and closest ally, had gone quiet, his text delayed, his tone increasingly detached. On a gray Thursday morning, with rain slicking the sidewalks outside his apartment, Jalen sat at his kitchen table staring at an open Craigslist app, about to list his father's vintage Les Paul guitar, a gift, a relic, a last resort. His finger hovered over the post ad button when his phone vibrated. The number was unknown. He almost ignored it, but instinct made him answer. "Jalen Brooks," a woman's voice asked. Calm, controlled, speaking. "Don't hang up. I don't work for Whitestone, and I'm not a journalist." "Then who are you?" he asked warily. "Someone who's been watching," she said, "and someone who believes you've been wronged. My employer would like to meet, tonight. Neutral ground. Discreet." Jalen's breath caught. "Why?" "Because," she replied, "you're not the only one who's been burned by Graham Whitaker. We have an opportunity to help each other, but you need to listen carefully." The woman gave him an address, a time, and one instruction: come alone, and bring the original Looply files. Jalen should have questioned it, should have doubted the risk. But desperation can make logic irrelevant. That night, dressed in black and with his tablet tucked under his coat, he stepped into the lobby of a private building in Soma, half office, half fortress. He wasn't here to beg. He wasn't here to pitch. He was here to move pieces. Kroll gestured to the chair across from him, and Jalen sat, laying his tablet on the polished black glass. "You've made enemies," Kroll said, his voice low, deliberate. "But the way they've moved against you tells me they're not just afraid of your idea. They're afraid of who you are becoming." Jalen didn't respond right away. He simply opened a folder on the tablet marked Operator Tier, Classified, and rotated the screen. Kroll leaned forward. His expression shifted. Then he looked up. "You're not just a founder." Jalen met his gaze. "I'm the managing director behind Fenwick 9. Silence. Kroll leaned back in his chair, studying him anew. Fenwick 9 was a whisper on Wall Street, a private, deeply veiled investment syndicate that had bought up quiet majority stakes in a series of struggling but strategically valuable tech firms over the last 18 months, including, as of 2 weeks ago, a controlling share in Whitestone's parent fund. Jalen let that truth settle before adding, "The acquisition was finalized through 3 offshore shells and 2 intermediary trusts. Graham doesn't even know yet. But as of Monday, I'll own voting control over the holding company that backs his board seats." Kroll's eyes narrowed, then smiled. "You planned this." Jalen nodded slowly. "I didn't just want funding. I wanted leverage. And now I have it." Kroll exhaled, impressed. "Why hide it?" Jalen folded his hands. "Because no one builds something worth protecting if they start at the top. I needed to know Looply could stand on its own. And it did, until they tried to bury it." He stood and walked toward the window, looking out over the skyline. "I come from a name that opens doors, but I chose to walk through the side entrance to see how they'd treat me if they didn't know who I was. Now I know." Kroll joined him at the glass. "The question is, what do you want to do with that power now?" Jalen turned, the storm in his chest now something sharper. "Expose everything. Not with noise, with precision." He picked up the tablet again, clicked a few times, and revealed a series of documents. Emails forwarded from interns, Slack exports, metadata trails from the Synchronet codebase, and a voice memo tagged leaked Whitaker personal line. They think I'm still playing catch-up, Jalen said. They don't realize I've already crossed the finish line. Kroll studied the data and nodded. We'll make our move. Quietly, publicly, strategically. Jalen smiled for the first time in days, tight, controlled, and dangerous. Start with the vote, he said. Then schedule the audit. This time, he was escorted by an executive assistant whose hands shook just slightly as she opened the door. The men inside were already seated, waiting, their faces rigid, some confused, others pale with dawning comprehension. At the head of the table sat Graham Whitaker, fingers steepled, mouth tight, a forced grin bending the corners of his lips like they were tethered to wire. "Well," Graham said after a beat, his voice strained with effort, "this is unexpected." Jalen took his seat at the far end, directly opposite Graham. He didn't look nervous. He looked settled, like a man who wasn't entering enemy territory, but reviewing property he already owned. He placed his tablet gently on the table and folded his hands. "No, Graham," he said calmly, his voice steady but resonant. "What was unexpected was being laughed out of this room 6 weeks ago by a man who now needs my signature to keep his company alive." The silence was thick and stunned. One of the younger board members coughed, clearly unsure where to look. Graham leaned forward, trying to reclaim control. "Let's not turn this into a sideshow," he said, the edge returning to his tone. "We're here to discuss the Volaris merger. Time is short." Jalen tilted his head slightly. "And yet you gave my pitch 4 minutes. Funny how timelines shift when your portfolio's at stake." A few seats down, CFO Richard Callahan shifted uncomfortably. "With respect," he began, "we were unaware of your position with Fenwick 9. Jalen cut in, voice sharper now. "You weren't unaware. You were uninterested." He tapped the tablet once, and the screen behind him lit up with a slide labeled Proposal, Leadership Transition, and Cultural Restructuring. Graham's nostrils flared. "What is this?" Jalen looked him in the eye. "This is the new agenda. We don't move forward with the Volaris merger, not 1 cent, until the following conditions are met." He tapped again. "Item 1. Immediate removal of all executives and staff named in documented acts of racial bias, mockery, or internal sabotage. That includes Trent Rourke, who currently markets my stolen architecture as his own." Gasps and shifting chairs followed. Graham sat rigid, jaw clenched. "You can't dictate internal staffing," he said coldly. Jalen's gaze hardened. "Actually, I can. Fenwick holds 61% of the voting shares as of last week. Every chair at this table that depends on that merger will abide by this or explain to shareholders why you passed on $2.3 billion to protect a group of fragile egos." A long pause followed. No one moved. No one spoke. Jalen continued, quieter but heavier. "You built a culture where power meant permission to humiliate, dismiss, and silence anyone who didn't fit your profile of genius. You built a throne out of excuses and called it leadership." He looked directly at Graham now. "And I want you to hear this for me, face to face. I didn't come back for revenge. I came back to fix the rot you planted in this company." Graham's face was stone, but Jalen wasn't finished. "Item 2, he said. "A public apology issued jointly by Whitestone and Synchronet, acknowledging the wrongful appropriation of Loop Lease framework, with attribution and restitution." The general counsel, a woman named Felicia Ward, blinked rapidly. "That could open us to litigation. I'm not suing," Jalen said flatly. "But the apology goes live, or the merger dies." One of the board members leaned toward Graham. "We can't afford to lose this. Our liquidity." Graham raised a hand. "I understand." His voice was like sandpaper. He turned toward Jalen, the defiance still burning behind his eyes, but his voice was subdued. "And what happens after this?" Jalen stood slowly, smoothing the front of his jacket. "Then you become what you never had the courage to be, accountable." Graham Whitaker sat at the head of the table one last time, his eyes bloodshot, jaw locked as the verdict was read out loud by Felicia Ward, Whitestone's legal counsel, whose clipped tone spared no dignity. due to substantiated evidence of ethical misconduct, reputational sabotage, and willful obstruction of fair equity practices. This board hereby recommends the immediate removal of Mr. Whitaker as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. The vote was unanimous. Graham said nothing. He didn't defend himself, didn't lash out, didn't storm away. He simply stood, adjusted the collar of his tailored suit, and walked out in silence, his footsteps echoing like a closing chapter down the corridor he once ruled without question. Word spread like wildfire. Major outlets picked up the story the next morning. Silicon Valley power shift. CEO ousted after hidden stakeholder exposes internal discrimination. The article on TechSlate included a side-by-side comparison of Synchronet's interface with Looplease original screenshots, with a bold headline reading, "Stolen Code. Silent Gatekeepers." But the real tremor hit when the Fenwick 9 ethics report was released to the public. Jalen didn't sign his name to it. He didn't need to. The document spoke for itself. A 47-page dossier detailing systemic bias, hostile internal communications, tampering with pitch evaluations, and targeted suppression of minority-led startups. Inside the appendix, a full list of names appeared. Those who had participated in the smear campaign, who had mocked Jalen on Slack, who had forwarded confidential pitch materials to competitors, and who had laughed at the phrase affirmative action experiment. Every quote was sourced, time-stamped, and linked to an anonymous submission or digital record. The industry was forced to look at itself, stripped of gloss. Some called it overkill. Most called it overdue. A prominent investor tweeted, "That ethics report is a mirror. If it makes you uncomfortable, ask yourself why." Within days, several individuals named in the document were suspended or terminated from positions across multiple firms. Universities rescinded speaking invitations. Boards began re-evaluating diversity charters not as PR checklists, but as cultural frameworks. Whitestone stock dipped briefly, but stabilized under interim leadership. The merger with Volaris was finalized on revised terms, with a new clause prioritizing ethical review and internal accountability. And in the middle of all of it, Jalen Brooks didn't take a victory lap. He didn't give interviews. He didn't post viral threads or accept book deals. Instead, he returned to the code, returned to his team, quietly reactivated Looplease dev pipeline. His Slack lit up again, this time not with mockery, but messages from engineers, founders, and strategists who wanted in, not because of pity, but because they'd seen what he'd built, and more importantly, how he had stood when they tried to knock it down. Months passed, and the noise eventually quieted. The headlines moved on, the industry shifted focus, and the public, as it always did, chased the next scandal. But inside the glass walls of Looplease modest, but growing new headquarters in downtown Oakland, something much deeper had taken root. Not just a company rebuilt, but a culture reshaped. Jalen Brooks no longer had to explain who he was. The name carried weight now, but it wasn't the recognition that mattered. It was the reach. Looply had closed its latest funding round in record time, not because it chased capital, but because capital finally chased competence. The product was stable, the team tighter than ever, and Jalen, for the first time, moved like a man no longer fighting to prove he belonged. He had already proven it. Now he was building space for others. One afternoon, as golden light filtered through the high windows of the Looply office, Jalen stepped into the conference room to find someone already waiting. A man in his early 50s, suit tailored, eyes downcast, hands folded in a way that suggested discomfort. Jalen recognized him instantly. It was Richard Callahan, the former CFO of Whitestone, the man who had once jokingly referred to Jalen's pitch as college-level ambition with streetwear confidence. Richard stood slowly. "I wasn't sure you'd actually meet with me," he said, voice low, words careful. Jalen nodded, expression unreadable. "I'm listening." Richard exhaled. "I came here not to ask for anything. I came to say I was wrong. About the product. About you. About the way we handled everything." Jalen didn't reply. Richard continued. "It wasn't just Whitaker. We enabled him. I enabled him. I laughed when I should have listened. I mocked what I didn't understand. I've spent 30 years in this industry, thinking I knew how innovation looked. You showed me I didn't." He hesitated. then reached into his briefcase and slid a folder across the table. I've spent the last 6 months working with underrepresented founders. No pay, no credit, just helping them find their footing. I've advised 6 teams already. 2 are in final stage talks with accelerators. He looked up, his voice steady. I'd like to help more. Through you. Jalen stared at the folder, then at the man across from him, and for a moment, neither said a word. Then Jalen reached for the file, opened it, and flipped through the notes. He stopped on a page where a startup name was circled in red. He frowned. This concept, he said slowly. This was Graham's, wasn't it? Richard nodded. An old idea. Never built. Just talked about. But a brilliant team picked it up independently. They got dismissed by every firm that once kissed Graham's ring. Sound familiar? Jalen smiled. Not cold. Not cruel. Just full of history. Yeah, he said. It does. 2 weeks later, Jalen launched the Second Look Fund, a $25 million commitment backed by a coalition of silent partners and a few bold firms who finally understood the cost of oversight. The fund specialized in startups that had been rejected, misjudged, or sidelined for reasons no pitch deck could fix. Founders with names that made people second-guess, accents that made rooms go quiet, resumes that didn't scream Ivy League. Richard became one of its lead advisors, not as a penance, but as proof that accountability meant nothing without action. And Graham? No one had heard from him since his ousting. But one day, a submission appeared in Looply's inbox, anonymous, undeveloped, raw, but under the metadata. The IP address traced back to a small coastal town where former executives often retreated in quiet exile. Jalen didn't reply. He didn't need to. The system had already replied for him. Redemption wasn't something he handed out. It was something people had to build on their own. Standing at the window of his office, watching the sun fall over the bay, Jalen thought of his mother's voice, of Malik's quiet return, of every door that had slammed in his face. And then he smiled, not the tight smile of defiance, not the guarded grin of survival, but something rare, something full. The smile of a man who had rewritten the ending they tried to assign him, not as a warning, but as a blueprint. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated with more powerful narratives that challenge injustice and celebrate redemption. Which part of Jalen's journey hit you the hardest? Was it the betrayal, the twist of power, or the final act of grace? Tell us what moment stood out most to you, and where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.